Stalingrad, today known as Volgograd, is a city that has witnessed the extremes of human endurance, cruelty, and sacrifice. It was here, along the banks of the Volga River, that one of the most brutal and decisive battles of World War II unfolded. The Battle of Stalingrad, which lasted from August 1942 to February 1943, was a turning point in the war, marking the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's ambitions in the Soviet Union. More than 2 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, died in the fighting, making it one of the deadliest battles in human history. The city itself was reduced to rubble, a scorched, shattered landscape of bombed-out buildings, tangled streets, and scorched earth. As Soviet and German forces clashed in desperate close-quarters combat, the city became a living hell. Every building, every street corner, every pile of rubble was fought over with a ferocity that defies imagination. Stalingrad's soil became soaked with the blood of soldiers from both sides, and its ruins were haunted by the cries of the dying. But the dead did not leave when the battle ended. The ghosts of Stalingrad, lost souls caught in the grip of a brutal, frozen purgatory, are said to linger still, trapped in the ruins of a city that no longer exists in the same form, but which holds the memory of their final, horrific moments. Over the years, stories have emerged from those who live in Volgograd, as well as visitors who have felt the strange and eerie presence of something otherworldly. Phantom soldiers, ghostly whispers, and strange apparitions have all been reported in the old battle sites, suggesting that while the war may have ended, its effects have not. Let me take you back to the battle's frozen ruins, where death reigned and where the shadows of the past still lurk. These are the specters of Stalingrad. It was a cold evening in Volgograd when I first heard the story of the ghost in Pavlov's house. I was sitting in a small cafe near the Volga, speaking with an old Soviet veteran named Yuri. Yuri was in his late 70s, his face worn and deeply lined, his eyes filled with the quiet strength of someone who had seen too much. He had grown up in Stalingrad and had lived through the battle as a child. Over the years, he had witnessed many strange and unsettling things in his city. But there was one story he shared with me that chilled me to the bone. We were talking about the historical significance of Pavlov's house, a building that had become a symbol of Soviet resilience during the battle. For nearly 2 months, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and his men had held the building against relentless German attacks. It became a fortress, a stronghold in the heart of the ruined city, and its defense was a pivotal moment in the battle. But Pavlov's house, Yuri told me, was also haunted. Yuri had first heard the story from his father, a soldier who had fought during the Battle of Stalingrad. His father had been one of the men tasked with defending the building in the final days of the battle. It was a bitterly cold night in December 1942, and the city was locked in the iron grip of winter. The ground was frozen solid, and the air was thick with the stench of death. The building itself was little more than a hollow shell, its walls riddled with bullet holes, its floors covered in debris and the bodies of the fallen. Yuri's father had been on sentry duty, standing guard in one of the building's upper floors. His breath fogged in the freezing air, and the only sound was the distant rumble of artillery fire and the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle. He was exhausted, cold, and on edge in conditions that had become normal in the nightmare that was Stalingrad. As he stood there, trying to stay awake, he heard something footsteps, faint but unmistakable, coming from one of the darkened rooms behind him. At first, he thought it was one of his comrades, but when he turned around, there was no one there. The room was empty, its only occupants the shadows that clung to the corners like ghosts. He shrugged it off, blaming his tired mind for playing tricks on him. But then, a few minutes later, he heard the footsteps again, this time closer. He spun around, his heart pounding, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, dressed in the ragged, blood-stained uniform of a Soviet soldier, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and dark. But before Yuri's father could speak, the figure disappeared, vanishing into the shadows as if it had never been there. Shaken, Yuri's father tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination. But over the next few nights, the strange occurrences continued. He and the other soldiers in Pavlov's house began to hear footsteps in the halls, voices whispering in the darkness, and the soft, eerie sound of someone or something crying in the night. One of the men, a young soldier named Mikhail, swore that he had seen the ghost up close. He had been on guard duty in the early hours of the morning when he heard the unmistakable sound of boots crunching on the frozen ground outside the building. Thinking it was a German patrol, Mikhail raised his rifle and prepared to fire. But when he looked through the cracked window, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing in the street below was the ghostly figure of a Soviet soldier, his uniform torn and covered in frost. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and his face was twisted in an expression of terror. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, staring up at the building as if waiting for something. Mikhail watched in horror as the figure slowly raised his hand and pointed toward the ruins of the building, his mouth opening as if to scream, but no sound came out. The next morning, Mikhail refused to return to his post. He told the others that the ghost had been one of their own, a soldier who had been killed during the first days of the battle. He believed that the man's spirit was still wandering the ruins of Stalingrad, searching for the comrades he had lost in the chaos of war. Years later, after the war had ended and the city had been rebuilt, Pavlov's house became a monument to the heroism of the Soviet soldiers who had defended it. But even after the reconstruction, strange things continued to happen. Yuri told me of a night in the early 1970s, long after the battle had ended, when a group of construction workers were renovating the area around Pavlov's house. It was late, and most of the workers had already gone home, leaving just a few men behind to finish up some final tasks. One of the men, a young laborer named Sergei, was cleaning up debris near the base of the building when he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. Thinking it was one of his colleagues, Sergei turned around, but there was no one there. Shrugging it off, Sergei continued his work, but the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, as if someone was walking directly toward him. He felt a chill run down his spine as the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Slowly, he turned around again, and that's when he saw it the same figure that Yuri's father had described all those years ago. The ghostly soldier was standing just a few feet away, his pale, hollow eyes locked on Sergei's face. His uniform was tattered and frozen, and his skin was stretched tight over his bones, as if he had been frozen in time. The soldier's lips moved, but no words came out, only a low, mournful whisper that sent a wave of cold fear through Sergei's body. Sergei stumbled backward, his heart pounding, but the ghost didn't move. It just stood there, watching him with those empty, dead eyes. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, dissolving into the shadows of the building. Terrified, Sergei ran from the site, refusing to return to work the next day. He told his foreman what he had seen, but the man laughed it off, calling it nonsense. But Sergei wasn't the only one to experience strange things near Pavlov's house. Over the years, other construction workers, tourists, even local residents have reported hearing footsteps, seeing ghostly figures, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread whenever they approached the building at night. Some say that the ghost is still searching for his comrades, lost in the chaos of the battle, forever bound to the ruins of Stalingrad. Others believe that he is trapped in an endless loop, reliving the horrors of the battle over and over again, unable to find peace. The ghost in Pavlov's house is just one of many spirits said to haunt the ruins of Stalingrad. The city, once a battleground where death ruled, is now a place where the living and the dead exist side by side, their stories intertwined. The specters of Stalingrad, phantom soldiers, ghostly whispers, and shadowy figures serve as reminders of the unimaginable horror that unfolded here. For those who visit the city today, it's easy to get lost in the history of the battle, to see the monuments and memorials as distant echoes of a time long past. But for those who are willing to look closer, to listen to the whispers in the night and feel the chill in the air, the ghosts of Stalingrad are still very much present. The battle may have ended, but the spirits of those who fought and died here remain, trapped in the ruins of a city that will never truly be at peace. So, if you ever find yourself walking the streets of Volgograd late at night, remember this: you are not alone. The shadows that move in the corners of your vision, the faint footsteps that echo behind you, and the cold breath on the back of your neck, They are the echoes of a battle that never really ended. The dead still walk here, their stories waiting to be told. And perhaps, if you're quiet enough, you might just hear the mournful beat of a ghostly drum, or catch a glimpse of a soldier lost in time, forever wandering the streets of Stalingrad in search of something that can never be found. The Battle of Stalingrad left the city in ruins. Its buildings crumbled into dust, its streets turned into desolate landscapes of debris, and its people forever scarred by the horrors of war. But among the shattered remnants of the city, one place stands out in the ghostly lore of Stalingrad, a place known only to those who dare to look beyond the surface of the city's history. It is called the Black Cathedral, a site said to be cursed by the blood and despair of the war. This abandoned structure was never completed, its foundations laid just before the war began, and its incomplete ruins are said to hold something far darker than the memories of battle. I first heard of the Black Cathedral from Elena, a local historian and resident of Volgograd, who had spent years researching the battle and its lasting impact on the city. She was a serious woman, her voice calm and measured, but there was a haunted look in her eyes when she spoke of the cathedral. It wasn't an official part of Volgograd's history. Most of the older generation remembered it only as an unfinished project, an ambitious plan for a church that was never realized due to the outbreak of war. But among locals, whispers of the Black Cathedral's curse had persisted for decades. Elena herself had been reluctant to believe the stories at first, dismissing them as nothing more than old superstitions. That was until she experienced the inexplicable herself. We met in a small apartment just a few blocks from the site of the battle's most intense fighting. The air outside was cold, the kind of biting wind that seemed to carry the weight of history with it. Inside, Elena and I sat at a small wooden table, a single lamp casting a soft glow over her collection of maps and documents related to Stalingrad's past. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, as though unsure of whether to tell me what she had learned. But once she began, the story flowed like a dark river, unsettling, eerie, and impossible to forget. In the late 1930s, as Stalingrad was rapidly industrializing, the Soviet government decided to build a grand cathedral in the city, a symbol of Soviet power and the resilience of the Russian Orthodox faith. The project was controversial from the beginning. Many saw it as a contradiction, given the atheistic policies of the Stalinist regime. But local leaders pressed forward, seeing the cathedral as a way to unite the city and demonstrate its growing importance. The design was ambitious. Massive stone walls, towering spires, and intricate stained glass that would have rivaled the great cathedrals of Europe. Construction began in the summer of 1940, just 2 years before the war would engulf the city. Workers laid the foundation, and the massive skeleton of the building began to rise against the skyline. But even in those early days, strange things began to happen at the construction site. Workers reported hearing voices in the tunnels beneath the building, whispers that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Tools would disappear, only to be found in strange, hidden places. And then there were the shadows, dark, flickering shapes that seemed to move just out of sight, vanishing when anyone tried to look directly at them. Many of the workers grew uneasy, but the project continued, driven forward by the demands of the state. But as war loomed on the horizon, the construction slowed and eventually came to a halt. By the time the German army reached Stalingrad in the summer of 1942, the Black Cathedral was little more than a half-built ruin, a skeletal frame standing amidst the chaos of the bombing raids. It wasn't long before the battlefield swallowed it up entirely. During the Battle of Stalingrad, the unfinished cathedral became another battleground. Soviet and German forces fought for control of the area, using the half-built structure as cover in the brutal, close-quarters combat that defined the battle. The grand arches that had once been meant to inspire awe were reduced to crumbling stone, and the scaffolding became a twisted maze of steel where soldiers fought and died. One particularly gruesome tale came from a Soviet platoon that had taken shelter in the ruins of the cathedral during the winter of 1942. The fighting in the surrounding area had been fierce, and the men were exhausted, cold, and hungry. They huddled together in the remains of what would have been the cathedral's main hall, surrounded by shattered stone and the debris of war. But as night fell, something strange began to happen. The air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural silence that seemed to press down on the soldiers. The wind, which had been howling through the broken windows, died away, and a strange, oppressive stillness settled over the ruins. Then the sounds began. At first, it was just a faint murmuring, barely audible over the soldiers' hushed conversations. But slowly the murmurs grew louder until they could be clearly heard, a chorus of voices whispering in the darkness. The men stood, their hands on their rifles, searching for the source of the sound. But there was no one there. The whispers seemed to come from the very walls of the cathedral, echoing off the cold stone like the voices of the dead. And then the shadows came. One of the soldiers, a young man named Victor, swore that he saw something moving in the darkness near the far end of the hall. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, just the flicker of a candle casting strange shapes on the walls. But as he watched, the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. They shifted and twisted, growing darker, denser, until they resembled human figures, tall, thin forms that moved silently across the room. Victor called out to his comrades, but before anyone could react, the shadows disappeared, melting back into the darkness as if they had never been there. But the whispers remained. By morning, the soldiers had abandoned the cathedral, too terrified to stay another night in the cursed place. They told their commanders about the strange sounds and the shadows, but their reports were dismissed as the ravings of men pushed to the brink by war. Still, the story of the Black Cathedral began to spread, and soon other soldiers began to avoid the ruins, convinced that something evil had taken root there. Decades after the battle, the ruins of the Black Cathedral still stood, untouched by the city's reconstruction efforts. It had become a forgotten relic, hidden away in the industrial outskirts of Volgograd, its crumbling walls overgrown with vines and weeds. But for Elena, the cathedral had always been a source of fascination. She had heard the stories as a child, tales of ghosts and shadows that haunted the building, of strange lights seen flickering in the windows at night, and of the whispers that still echoed through its empty halls. As a historian, Elena was determined to uncover the truth. She spent years researching the construction of the cathedral, interviewing survivors of the battle, and poring over old Soviet documents in search of answers. But the more she learned, the more questions she uncovered. The construction records were incomplete, filled with strange gaps and unexplained delays, and the stories from the war stories of soldiers disappearing in the ruins, of entire platoons driven mad by the whispers, seemed to hint at something far darker than she had imagined. Then, one winter's night, Elena decided to visit the cathedral herself. At first, it was just a faint murmuring, barely audible over the soldiers' hushed conversations. But slowly the murmurs grew louder until they could be clearly heard, a chorus of voices whispering in the darkness. The men stood, their hands on their rifles, searching for the source of the sound. But there was no one there. The whispers seemed to come from the very walls of the cathedral, echoing off the cold stone like the voices of the dead. And then the shadows came. One of the soldiers, a young man named Victor, swore that he saw something moving in the darkness near the far end of the hall. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, just the flicker of a candle casting strange shapes on the walls. But as he watched, the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. They shifted and twisted, growing darker, denser, until they resembled human figures, tall, thin forms that moved silently across the room. Victor called out to his comrades, but before anyone could react, the shadows disappeared, melting back into the darkness as if they had never been there. But the whispers remained. By morning, the soldiers had abandoned the cathedral, too terrified to stay another night in the cursed place. They told their commanders about the strange sounds and the shadows, but their reports were dismissed as the ravings of men pushed to the brink by war. Still, the story of the Black Cathedral began to spread, and soon other soldiers began to avoid the ruins, convinced that something evil had taken root there. Decades after the battle, the ruins of the Black Cathedral still stood, untouched by the city's reconstruction efforts. It had become a forgotten relic, hidden away in the industrial outskirts of Volgograd, its crumbling walls overgrown with vines and weeds. But for Elena, the cathedral had always been a source of fascination. She had heard the stories as a child, tales of ghosts and shadows that haunted the building, of strange lights seen flickering in the windows at night, and of the whispers that still echoed through its empty halls. As a historian, Elena was determined to uncover the truth. She spent years researching the construction of the cathedral, interviewing survivors of the battle, and poring over old Soviet documents in search of answers. But the more she learned, the more questions she uncovered. The construction records were incomplete, filled with strange gaps and unexplained delays, and the stories from the war stories of soldiers disappearing in the ruins, of entire platoons driven mad by the whispers, seemed to hint at something far darker than she had imagined. Then, one winter's night, Elena decided to visit the cathedral herself. Elena had heard the warnings. Locals still avoided the area around the Black Cathedral, and even the bravest ghost hunters rarely ventured inside its walls. But Elena was determined to see the place for herself, to confront the strange stories that had haunted her for years. She arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown path that led to the ruins. The air was bitterly cold, and a thick layer of snow covered the ground, muffling her footsteps as she made her way toward the cathedral. As she approached, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over her, a heavy, oppressive weight that seemed to crush the air from her lungs. The cathedral loomed before her, its stone walls blackened and crumbling, its spires broken and jagged against the darkening sky. Elena stood at the entrance for a long moment, her breath fogging in the freezing air, before finally stepping inside. The interior was just as ruined as she had expected. Piles of rubble littered the floor, and the once grand arches had collapsed into jagged piles of stone. But as Elena walked deeper into the cathedral, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows seemed to shift around her, flickering at the edges of her vision, and the silence was so thick it felt almost suffocating. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, just a soft murmur, barely audible over the sound of Elena's own breathing. But as the minutes passed, the whispers grew louder, until they filled the air, echoing off the stone walls like a chorus of the dead. Elena stood frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest, as the voices surrounded her, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. Suddenly, she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned, her flashlight sweeping across the empty hall, but there was no one there. Just shadows, long, dark shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as if they were alive. Elena's hands trembled as she tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just her imagination. But the shadows continued to move, and then she saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. They moved slowly, silently, gliding across the floor like wraiths. Elena's breath caught in her throat as the figures came closer, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes black pits that seemed to stare straight through her. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body refused to move. The figures passed by her, their cold, dead eyes never leaving her, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling her head with a deafening roar. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The figures disappeared, melting back into the shadows, and the whispers faded into silence. Elena stood there, trembling, her heart racing, as the cold air pressed in around her. She didn't know how long she had stood there, but when she finally gathered the strength to move, she stumbled out of the cathedral, her legs weak and her mind racing. She never returned. To this day, the Black Cathedral remains a forgotten ruin, hidden away in the industrial outskirts of Volgograd. Locals still speak of the strange happenings that occur there, the whispers, the shadows, the ghostly figures that haunt its halls. Some say that the cathedral was cursed from the beginning, that it was built on ground that should never have been disturbed. Others believe that the horrors of the battle of the blood and death that soaked the ground awoke something dark and ancient, something that still lingers in the ruins. Whatever the truth may be, the Black Cathedral stands as a chilling reminder of the war that once consumed Stalingrad. It is a place where the past refuses to rest, where the dead still walk, and where the whispers of forgotten souls echo through the cold, dark halls. If you ever find yourself in Volgograd and you feel the pull of the old stories, remember this. The Black Cathedral is not a place for the living. It is a place where shadows move, where voices speak in the darkness, and where the ghosts of the past wait for those who dare to listen. And if you do hear the whispers, do not follow them. They are not calling you, they are warning you. In the annals of war, the dead are often remembered in numbers, casualties counted, graves marked, names etched into stone memorials. But on the Eastern Front during the Battle of Stalingrad, many were lost without a trace. Among those lost was a Soviet field medic, a young woman named Nadia, whose spirit is said to linger among the ruins of the war, still searching for the wounded she could never save. Her ghost has become one of the most famous legends to emerge from the haunted ruins of Stalingrad, a chilling reminder of the toll that war takes, not only on those who fight, but on those who try and fail to heal. I first heard of Nadia's haunting from a local tour guide named Victor. We were walking through Mamayev Kurgan, a hill that had been the site of some of the fiercest fighting during the battle, now a solemn war memorial. The hill overlooks the city of Volgograd, a panoramic reminder of both the destruction and the eventual triumph of the Soviet forces. As we reached the top of the hill, with the towering statue of Motherland Calls looming above us, Victor grew quiet. He lit a cigarette and, after a few moments of silence, told me about the night he encountered Nadia's ghost. Victor was not the type to believe in ghost stories. He had grown up in Volgograd, surrounded by the legends and myths that permeate the city's history, but he had always dismissed them as superstitions. Until that is, the night he found himself face to face with one of the most tragic and well-known spirits of the Battle of Stalingrad, the lost Soviet medic. Nadia wasn't a soldier, but she was no stranger to battle. Like many women during World War II, she volunteered as a medic, driven by a fierce sense of patriotism and a desire to help her fellow countrymen. She was only 19 when she joined the Red Army, a young woman with dreams of becoming a doctor after the war. But Stalingrad changed everything. When the Germans launched their attack on the city in the summer of 1942, Nadia found herself stationed at a field hospital near the city center, working alongside other medics and nurses to tend to the endless stream of wounded soldiers. The conditions were horrific. The hospital was little more than a makeshift shelter, tents and tarps set up among the rubble, where the wounded were brought in from the front lines. The sounds of battle were never far away. The constant boom of artillery, the rattle of machine gun fire, and the screams of men too far gone to save. Nadia worked day and night, barely stopping to sleep or eat, her hands stained with blood as she did everything she could to help the wounded. But the losses were staggering. For every soldier she managed to save, it seemed like a dozen more were brought in too late, their bodies broken beyond repair. The medics worked without proper supplies, their bandages and medicine quickly running out, and the dead began to pile up around them, their bodies left in hastily dug mass graves when there was no time for a proper burial. Nadia's spirit was slowly crushed under the weight of the suffering around her, but she refused to give up. She continued to push herself beyond the limits of exhaustion, moving from one wounded soldier to the next, her hands shaking with fatigue, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Her comrades began to worry about her, but there was no stopping her. Nadia was driven by something deeper than duty, a desperate need to save just one more life, to make some small difference in the midst of the carnage. But in the end, Nadia became a casualty of the battle herself. One cold night in November 1942, just weeks before the tide of the battle began to turn in the Soviet Union's favor, Nadia vanished. She had been sent to the front lines to retrieve wounded soldiers, but she never returned. Some said she had been caught in a German artillery barrage, her body buried beneath the rubble of a collapsed building. Others believed she had wandered too far into no man's land and had been captured or killed by German troops. Her body was never found. In the chaos of the battle, her disappearance went unnoticed by all but those who had worked alongside her. She became just one more name on a long list of the missing, another life lost in the senseless violence of war. But the story didn't end there. The legend of Nadia's ghost began not long after the battle had ended. Soviet soldiers who had survived the brutal winter of 1942-1943 and remained in Stalingrad to rebuild the city started reporting strange encounters near the old battlefield. They spoke of seeing a woman dressed in the tattered remnants of a medic's uniform wandering through the ruins at night. One of the first to see her was a Red Army officer named Ivanov. He had been stationed near the Volga River, overseeing the construction of makeshift shelters for the returning civilians. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cold night began to settle in, Ivanov spotted a figure moving among the rubble. At first, he thought it was one of his men, but as he drew closer, he realized it was a woman. She was young, with dark hair that fell loosely around her shoulders. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and hollow. She wore a blood-stained medic's armband on her arm, and her hands were clutching a medical kit, as though she were still on duty. Ivanov called out to her, but she didn't respond. She just kept walking, her head down, her steps slow and deliberate. Curious, Ivanov followed her, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. But no matter how fast he walked, the woman always remained just out of reach, her figure flickering in and out of sight like a ghost. Finally, after several minutes, she disappeared altogether, vanishing into the mist that clung to the ruins. When Ivanov returned to his camp, he told his comrades about the strange encounter. But they only laughed, dismissing his story as the result of exhaustion or too much vodka. Yet over the following weeks, more soldiers reported seeing the same woman always at night, always wandering the ruins with her medical kit in hand. The whispers began to spread. Nadia had returned. Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that dominates the skyline of Volgograd, was one of the bloodiest battlefields of the war. Thousands of Soviet and German soldiers died fighting for control of the hill, their bodies piling up in the trenches and craters that scarred the landscape. After the war, Mamayev Kurgan became a massive memorial complex, with the towering statue of Motherland Calls standing watch over the city below. But the hill is also said to be haunted by the spirits of those who died there, and none more famously than the ghost of Nadia. Viktor, the tour guide, had grown up hearing stories of the ghosts of Mamayev Kurgan. His grandfather, who had fought in the battle, had told him about the strange lights that could sometimes be seen flickering on the hill at night, and the eerie whispers that seemed to come from the ground itself. But it wasn't until Victor experienced it for himself that he truly believed the stories. It was late one evening, just after the last tour of the day. Victor had stayed behind to clean up, and as he walked up the winding path toward the top of the hill, he felt a sudden chill in the air. The sun had just set, and the sky was a deep shade of purple, the first stars beginning to appear overhead. Victor stopped for a moment to take in the view, but as he stood there, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye, a figure standing among the trees near the base of the hill. At first, he thought it was one of the other guides, but as he looked closer, he realized it was a woman. She was standing perfectly still, her head bowed, her hands clutching something close to her chest. Victor felt a strange sense of unease wash over him, but he couldn't take his eyes off her. The woman began to move, slowly at first, walking up the hill with deliberate steps. Victor watched in silence as she approached, her figure becoming clearer with each passing moment. She was wearing a tattered Soviet medic's uniform, the red cross on her armband barely visible through the dirt and blood that stained her sleeves. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, and her expression was one of deep sorrow. As she drew closer, Victor realized who she was. This was Nadia, the lost Soviet medic. Victor's heart raced as the woman passed by him, her footsteps silent on the gravel path. She didn't acknowledge his presence, didn't even seem to notice him, as though she were in another world entirely. Victor watched in stunned silence as she continued to climb the hill, her eyes fixed on some distant point in the horizon. Without thinking, Victor followed her. He didn't know why something about her presence was both terrifying and deeply compelling. There was an air of tragedy about her, a sorrow so profound that it seemed to weigh down the very air around her. As they reached the top of Mamayev Kurgan, the woman stopped. She turned and looked out over the city, the lights of Volgograd twinkling in the distance. For a brief moment, Victor thought she might turn and speak to him, but instead, she simply stood there. Her shoulders slumped as though she were carrying the weight of the entire war on her back. And then, without a word, she vanished. Victor stood there for what felt like hours, his heart still pounding in his chest, the cold wind biting at his skin. He didn't know what he had just seen, but he knew one thing for certain. Nadia's spirit was still there, still searching for the wounded she could never save, still haunted by the lives she had lost. The story of Nadia, the lost Soviet medic, has continued to spread over the years. Visitors to Mamayev Kurgan and other battle sites in Volgograd still report seeing her wandering the hills, her ghostly figure moving silently through the ruins of the war. Some say they have heard her calling out for help, her voice soft and distant, carried on the wind. Others claim to have felt her cold presence beside them, as though she were still tending to the wounded, still trying to fulfill her duty even in death. But no matter how many people see her, one thing remains the same. Nadia is a ghost trapped in time, forever bound to the battlefield where she disappeared. She is a symbol of the countless lives lost in the battle of the medics, nurses, and soldiers who gave everything and received nothing in return. If you ever find yourself on Mamayev Kurgan at dusk, as the sun sets and the shadows grow long, listen closely. You might hear the faint sound of footsteps on the gravel, or catch a glimpse of a woman in a tattered medic's uniform, her hands still clutching a medical kit. And if you do, remember that Nadia is still searching for the comrades she could never save, for the lives lost in the chaos of war, but she will never find them. The battlefield of Stalingrad is her eternal purgatory, and her spirit, like so many others, is bound to the ruins of a city that will never forget the horrors of its past. Nadia's story is not just a ghost story. It is a reminder of the human cost of war, of the lives shattered and the dreams lost. And as long as her spirit roams the battlefield, the dead of Stalingrad will never be truly forgotten. The city of Stalingrad, now Volgograd, was not just a battleground on land, it was also a sky scorched with war. As the battle raged for months, both German and Soviet forces relied heavily on their air units to drop supplies, reinforcements, and bombs. Gumrak Airfield, located just outside the city, became a crucial lifeline for the German 6th Army, which was encircled by the Soviet forces during the infamous winter of 1942 to 1943. The airfield was a final glimmer of hope for the starving, desperate German soldiers trapped in the hellish siege of Stalingrad. But Gumrak Airfield itself soon became a graveyard. The Soviet encirclement tightened, and the airfield was bombarded relentlessly. Planes crashed, pilots perished, and the desperate calls for supplies turned into cries of doom. Thousands of German soldiers and airmen died there, their last moments filled with icy terror and the realization that they were abandoned to their fate. The Germans called it the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, where death lurked everywhere, even in the skies. The ghosts of those doomed airmen are said to still haunt the remains of Gumrak, their final flight forever delayed. Among the many stories of supernatural encounters at Stalingrad, the legend of the phantom pilots of Gumrak Airfield stands out for its eerie atmosphere and tragic despair. Their spirits are said to appear at night, their ghostly planes circling the skies above the ruined airfield, forever searching for a place to land. I first heard about the phantom pilots from a Russian historian named Pavel, an expert on the Battle of Stalingrad, who had spent years researching the lesser-known aspects of the siege. Pavel was a pragmatic man, but he was also deeply in tune with the emotional scars left by the battle. We were standing on the edge of what used to be Gumrak Airfield, now an overgrown field with barely any visible signs of the war that once ravaged it. As he spoke, a cold wind swept across the landscape, making the already haunting atmosphere even more intense. Pavel wasn't a man who believed in ghosts, but as he told me the story of the phantom pilots, his voice lowered and his demeanor shifted. He had no explanation for what he had seen, or rather, what he had felt on a particularly cold winter night. It was then that I realized that even skeptics had to confront the unexplainable at Gumrak. During the final months of the Battle of Stalingrad, Gumrak Airfield became one of the last outposts for the German forces. The encircled soldiers depended on the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, to bring them food, ammunition, and supplies. But as the Soviet forces closed in, the airfield itself came under constant bombardment. The conditions were impossible. Planes landed on bomb-cratered runways, often crashing or being shot down before they even touched the ground. The snow and ice made the airfield a treacherous place, and many airmen perished without ever reaching their destination. One by one, the supply flights ceased. Desperate German soldiers would look up at the sky, waiting for the low hum of a plane, their last hope of survival, only to see nothing but empty clouds. Gumrak became a symbol of despair, and it was said that many of the pilots who tried to land there did so knowing it was a suicide mission. When the airfield finally fell to the Soviets in late January 1943, it was nothing more than a frozen wasteland littered with wreckage and the bodies of dead soldiers and airmen. The survivors who managed to escape the city spoke of an eerie silence that hung over the airfield in those final days, a silence punctuated only by the occasional ghostly wail of the wind, which some said sounded like the engines of planes that never came. But that silence didn't last. It was a quiet evening in the early 1990s when Pavel first heard the stories of the phantom pilots. The Soviet Union had recently dissolved, and a new sense of freedom had allowed for the exploration of history that had long been suppressed. Pavel, who had been working on a research project about the air campaigns over Stalingrad, visited the ruins of Gumrak Airfield late one night, hoping to get a sense of the place where so many desperate flights had taken off and ended in tragedy. It was a cold winter night, and the air was thick with fog. Pavel had driven out to the airfield alone, parking his car on the edge of the overgrown field where the runways had once been. As he walked through the frozen landscape, the only sound was the crunch of snow beneath his boots and the distant rustling of the wind through the bare trees. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the field in near total darkness. Pavel stood in the center of the field, imagining what it must have been like for those pilots, trying to land in such conditions, knowing that their chances of survival were slim. He felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow, so many lives lost, so many hopes crushed in this desolate place. He stayed there for a while, lost in thought, before deciding to head back to his car. That's when he heard it. At first, it was faint, a low, distant hum, barely audible over the wind. Pavel stopped, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and he realized with a start that it sounded like the engine of a plane. He looked up, expecting to see lights in the sky, but there was nothing, just the thick, swirling fog. The sound, however, continued to grow louder, and Pavel felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. It was the unmistakable roar of an approaching aircraft, but there was no plane to be seen. Pavel's heart raced as the sound of the engines grew deafening, as if a plane were coming in for a landing right above him. He ducked instinctively, his eyes scanning the sky for any sign of the aircraft, but the fog was impenetrable. The engines roared louder and louder, and then, with a bone-chilling abruptness, the sound stopped. Silence fell over the airfield once again. Pavel stood frozen in place, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He knew what he had heard, but there was no rational explanation for it. There had been no planes flying that night, and the airfield hadn't been operational for decades, and yet the sound had been too real to dismiss as mere imagination. Shaken, Pavel returned to his car and left the airfield, but the experience haunted him for weeks. He told a few of his colleagues about what had happened, but most of them brushed it off as a trick of the mind. Still, Pavel couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there that night, something that hadn't quite left the airfield. Pavel wasn't the only one to experience strange occurrences at Gumrak Airfield. Over the years, several others who visited the site reported hearing similar sounds, ghostly engine noises, the distant hum of planes flying overhead, and even the faint, crackling voices of pilots calling out for help over long-dead radios. The stories became so frequent that locals began to avoid the airfield at night, claiming that the spirits of the lost airmen were still trying to land their doomed planes, forever trapped in the final moments of their last flights. One chilling account came from a group of Russian soldiers stationed near Volgograd in the late 1990s. They had been conducting a training exercise near the old airfield, camping out in the freezing cold. One night, As they sat around a campfire, they heard the unmistakable sound of planes approaching. At first, they thought it was part of the exercise, a flyover by military jets, but when they looked up, the sky was empty. The sound of engines grew louder, as if multiple planes were circling above them, and the men began to feel uneasy. The planes seemed to come closer and closer, the roar of the engines so loud that they had to shout to hear each other over the noise. And then, without warning, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. The men were left staring at the sky, their faces pale and their hearts pounding. They had no explanation for what had happened. There had been no planes, no lights in the sky, nothing but the eerie, disembodied sound of engines that had come and gone in the blink of an eye. The soldiers packed up their camp and left the area the next morning, unwilling to spend another night near the haunted airfield. The most terrifying encounter, however, came from a pilot, a man named Sergei, who had flown over the Volgograd region in the early 2000s. Sergei was an experienced pilot with thousands of flight hours under his belt. He had never believed in ghosts or superstitions, but what happened during one particular flight made him question everything he thought he knew. It was a routine reconnaissance flight, and Sergei was flying alone in clear skies over the Volgograd area. As he approached the region where Gumrak airfield once stood, he heard something strange in his headset. A crackling, faint transmission that sounded like radio chatter. At first, he thought it was just interference, but as he listened more closely, he realized the voices were speaking in German. The transmission was weak, barely audible, but Sergei could make out fragments of conversation pilots calling out for help, reporting engine failures, asking for landing clearance. The voices were panicked, filled with desperation, and Sergei felt a growing sense of unease as he listened. He tried to respond, but the transmission cut out as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the empty static of his radio. Sergei felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. There were no German planes in the area, and the war had been over for more than half a century. Yet the voices he had heard were real, unmistakable, as if they had come from pilots lost in time. When Sergei landed and reported the strange transmission, his superiors dismissed it as a technical glitch, but Sergei knew better. He had heard the voices of the dead pilots who had never made it home, still trying to land on a runway that no longer existed. The legend of the phantom pilots of Gumrak airfield endures to this day, a chilling reminder of the horrors of war and the desperate final moments of those who perished trying to escape Stalingrad. The old airfield, now little more than a forgotten patch of land, remains a haunted place where the echoes of the past still linger in the cold night air. Those who dare to visit the site often leave with stories of their own, of strange sounds, ghostly figures, and the unmistakable hum of planes that never arrive. The phantom pilots are still out there, circling the skies above Volgograd, forever searching for a safe place to land, their souls trapped in the icy purgatory of their final flight. If you ever find yourself near Gumrak airfield on a cold, foggy night, listen carefully. You might hear the faint roar of engines overhead, or the distant crackle of a long-dead radio transmission. And if you do, know that the phantom pilots are still flying, their last mission unfinished, their fate sealed in the frozen sky over Stalingrad. And whatever you do, don't look up. Some flights are better left unseen. The ghosts of Stalingrad are not just legends, nor are they mere echoes of a distant past. They are remnants of a trauma so profound, so horrific, that the land itself seems to remember. The siege of Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was a maelstrom of human suffering, where the living and the dead collided in the freezing ruins of a city on the brink of annihilation. As we walk those blood-soaked streets today, we are reminded not only of the bravery and sacrifice of the soldiers and civilians who endured that nightmare, but also of the deep scars the battle left behind. The tales of the Phantom Brigade, the Woman in White, the lost Soviet medic, and the phantom pilots of Gumrak airfield are just a few among countless stories of the supernatural that swirl around the ruins of Volgograd. For the people who live here, these stories are part of the fabric of their history. They remind us that war leaves more than just physical devastation in its wake. It leaves behind the souls of those whose lives were cut short, their hopes and dreams shattered in the chaos. Some say that these ghosts are simply the byproduct of an unimaginably violent past, spirits trapped in a purgatory of endless suffering. Others believe that the land itself, imbued with the energy of so much death, has become a portal, allowing the dead to interact with the living in a desperate attempt to find peace. But whatever the explanation, one thing is clear. Stalingrad is a place where the dead refuse to rest. The modern city of Volgograd has rebuilt itself over the ruins, but it will never forget what happened here. The stories persist, passed down from generation to generation, and those who visit the city often leave with a deep sense of unease. They speak of strange lights flickering in the darkness, of footsteps in the night, and of ghostly figures watching them from the shadows. The specters of Stalingrad are as real to them as the statues and memorials that now dot the landscape. As you stand on the banks of the Volga River, looking out over the city that once crumbled beneath the weight of war, it is easy to feel the presence of those who came before. The wind that whispers through the streets carries the voices of the past, cries for help, for mercy, for peace. The ruins that remain are not just stones and rubble, but monuments to the countless lives lost in one of the darkest chapters of human history. If you ever find yourself walking through Volgograd, as the sun sets and the shadows lengthen, take a moment to stop and listen. You may hear the soft, mournful beat of a drum, the distant hum of a phantom plane, or the footsteps of soldiers marching through the fog. You may catch a glimpse of a figure in white, her sorrowful eyes searching for something she will never find. And if you do, remember, these are not just stories. They are the ghosts of Stalingrad, still wandering through a city that remembers their pain, still searching for the peace that eluded them in life. The battle may have ended long ago, but for the dead of Stalingrad, the war continues. As we leave these haunted grounds behind, we are left with an unsettling question. How many of the soldiers who fought here truly found rest? And how many still walk the ruins, trapped between worlds, their souls forever bound to the battlefield? Perhaps the dead of Stalingrad will never find peace. But in their stories, we find a reminder of the horrors of war, of the fragility of life, and of the haunting legacy that such devastation leaves in its wake. And as long as their ghosts continue to walk the city, they will never be forgotten. The shadows of Stalingrad will remain, etched into the fabric of the city and the memories of those who dare to listen to the whispers of the past. And perhaps, just perhaps, the spirits of Stalingrad are waiting for someone to remember, for someone to understand their endless search for closure. Until then, they will remain.